John turned to Colton. Cindy has also had her hands full with your active bunch, and some of them are as tall as you now. She's serving on the church's general board over physical fitness and athletics, and she loves it. Many of her ideas have been adopted throughout the church. The women in Zion are in better physical shape than they've ever been. How about the men? Colton asked. You'd think the plagues might have helped them slim down a little. Let's just say they're making progress, John said with a smile. Hello, and welcome back to WordWise. I'm your intrepid host, Kit, and today I'll be discussing Chad Daybell's 8th novel, The Keys of the Kingdom. And yes, there is a grammatical error in the title. It ought to be The Keys to the Kingdom. That's what happens when you refuse to hire a real editor to work at your publishing company. This is the 4th book in Chad's worst series, Standing in Holy Places. The entire series is just an expanded list of end times prophecies poorly fictionalized, and I can't wait to be done with it. This one might be his worst book. It's sort of a tie between this one, The Celestial City, and the last book in this series. This one, though, is just complete chaos as far as plotting goes, characterization, continuity. So let's jump in. Chad's author's note follows its usual formula. First, he stresses that the story is fictional, and then he says all of this is going to happen very soon. Then he writes this. I think we all have family and friends who scoff a little at the belief that our daily lives are going to change soon, despite the mounting evidence. I have a good friend who is very nonchalant about the future. He has read these novels and thinks they're entertaining, but for some reason he can't imagine these events happening within his lifetime, or even in his young son's lifetime. In some ways I wish he were right, but he's not. I assure you, the Savior is not delaying his second coming. Fun! Now we know there are specific people Chad is looking to see punished for their lack of faith. The next section is called Trouble on the Horizon. It's basically a rundown of what's happened between the last book and this one. The coalition is reforming with the goal of destroying America and Israel. One interesting note, the coalition had recently made great strides to properly educate their people by emphasizing science over faith. Organized religion was frowned upon as a potential threat to the group's objectives. I don't know how organized religion is a threat, but I think the dig at science education is interesting. This book came out in 2010, so maybe the situation was different at the time, but today, Chad's son Garth is a science teacher. Then he goes through each of the 3 families that this book is about. Although really, at this point, it's mostly just about Josh. All of the women are teaching or looking after children, which includes wise old baby Daniel. Daniel is nearly 3 years old and attends a special preschool class at the school. Although he still can't talk, he has learned to stand and can limp along with the help of a small crutch under his arm. He always has a smile on his face and is a great example of perseverance to the other children. So, is Daniel Tiny Tim from A Christmas Carol? I feel like all he needs is a newsboy cap and a Cockney accent, and it's Christmas time. Here's what Chad says about Josh and Kim. Josh and Kim Brown are still adjusting to Josh's new assignment to serve as an apostle in Israel for the foreseeable future. It came as a shock to them, and they miss each other deeply. Chad is being cagey here, and it doesn't work. Josh has been told to go to Jerusalem and use his priesthood powers to defend Israel. There's no possible way he doesn't know that this role is described in the book of Revelations, and that it says that he and the other apostle, Colton, will be in Jerusalem for 3.5 years, and then they'll be murdered. Josh knows, Kim presumably knows, Colton knows, everybody knows, but Chad wants it to be a surprise to the reader, so he doesn't let any of the characters acknowledge it. In fact, sometimes they act in ways that seem to contradict that knowledge. And maybe that would work for readers who aren't familiar with the prophecy, but it's kind of infuriating to those of us who are. I'm also not sure why he decided to value surprising his readers over taking advantage of the poignancy that would come from Kim and Josh both knowing that this is a last mission for Josh. I would have played the heck out of that if it were me. Chapter 1 begins with Josh and the other apostle Colton going to Jerusalem. They are flying to Israel in a jet. Where did they get a jet? I don't know. Josh briefly recalls how the prophet told him and Colton about their new assignment some weeks or months before. They were both surprised to receive the assignment, but they humbly accepted it and went home to tell their families. Josh and Kim had stayed up most of the night talking and holding each other close, knowing the importance of the assignment and the fact that they would be separated for longer than they had ever been. Yeah, forever, 'cause he's gonna die. Doesn't it make more sense if they stayed up all night holding each other and talking if they both knew he was gonna die? When Chad says they'll be separated for longer than ever before, what he means is Josh is going to die. But he doesn't want to admit that, partly because he doesn't want to ruin the surprise, but partly also because he's trying to minimize death. We're going to see that idea more and more in this book and in the next one. I guess I shouldn't have told my kids that I'd be seeing them soon, Colton had said. That wasn't exactly true. Josh had nodded grimly. This is definitely a one-way trip. Why did Colton tell his 4 kids he'd see them soon? He knows he's lying. He knows he's going to die with Josh. And why is Josh so flippant about his impending death here? This is definitely a one-way trip. Wow, you're so cool and indifferent, Josh. John the Revelator is flying the jet. Apparently he has a thing for aviation. This is John explaining exactly how they're going to get into Jerusalem in their jet. These smaller cities aren't as well armed with anti-aircraft weapons because the Israelis know that Jerusalem is the main target of their enemies, John said. But as we get closer to the city, I'm sure they'll be shooting at us. So strap on your parachutes and be ready for anything. When I tell you to jump out the side door, do it. The apostles were surprised at John's instructions. Colton asked, "Can't we just land the plane somewhere out here in the desert and walk to Jerusalem?" John shook his head. The security around Jerusalem is so tight that you'd never get into the city from that far away. I need to get you close enough that you'll be able to parachute inside the city. I think he actually meant into the city. I understand that it's more exciting to have Josh and Colton parachute into Jerusalem than it is for them to just apply for visas and enter the country legally. But come on. As the country has recently demonstrated, Israel has well-developed defenses. You can't just fly a jet over it and expect not to get shot out of the sky. So at John's insistence, Josh and Colton parachute out of the plane, which John then puts through some wacky maneuvers in order to distract the sharpshooters. Chad casually throws in that Josh and Colton have both parachuted before. Which, okay. This quote comes from after Josh and Colton have landed. John's jet passed over them once more, this time with flames erupting from the tail. The jet nosedived into a small knoll close by, shaking the ground and knocking the apostles to their knees. Before they could even get to their feet, John was standing next to them. His clothes were charred and smoking, and he had an intense look on his face. "That sure didn't go as planned, but we're still okay," John said. I guess that means he teleported after the crash, but my partner suggested that maybe he just ran so fast that his clothes caught on fire. I seem to recall that happening to the Flash once or twice before he got his special suit. See, we can't know for certain because Chad has never explained John's translated being powers, so we don't know if he can teleport or if he has super speed. Either way, that's the end of chapter 1. John hides Josh and Colton in an old farmhouse, but the Israeli soldiers bomb it. Somehow, Josh and Colton aren't hurt. John digs them out of the rubble and puts them in the back of a tricycle with a flatbed attached and piles stuff on top of them. I tried to research whether or not one can actually procure a tricycle with a flatbed big enough to conceal 2 grown men in it, and concluded it must have been a custom job. Can you imagine how much that tricycle must have weighed? You're trying to battle it with these 2 guys in the back. Anyway. John trikes Josh and Colton to Jerusalem, even though he said they were going to parachute into the city. I guess that didn't work out, and they landed somewhere in the desert after all, and then they had to trike in. So here's how they get past the checkpoint outside of Jerusalem. This is John speaking to the security officer. On my previous stops here, I've given the guard a few apples to show my appreciation for his hard work. Maybe I can do even better for you. John reached into the bed of the tricycle and pulled out a cardboard box near Josh's feet. Here you go, sir. I'm going to hand you this entire box of delicious apples, and you can just look the other way as I pass through. The guard took the box in his arms, but said, I don't know if I feel good. Thank you, John said, cutting him off as he pushed the tricycle through the gate. The guard simply watched him pedal away before finally setting the box down and picking out a nice apple to munch on. I guess Chad thinks it's hard to get apples in Israel? I swear, I give Chad so much undeserved credit that I'm starting to gaslight myself over things like this. I actually looked up whether or not you could get apples in Israel, because I foolishly thought for a brief moment that maybe Chad knew something I didn't, which is how I now know that Israel, in addition to producing over 100 tons of apples annually, was the 28th largest importer of fresh apples in 2022. Thanks for making me learn stuff, Chad. John takes Josh and Colton to the BYU Jerusalem campus, which is a real place. Yes, I googled that too. All programs are currently suspended, however, which is a surprising parallel to the book, in which campus has been abandoned since the US collapsed. John, however, has stocked one of the dorm rooms with water and food, which I'm going to assume means apples. Then he takes Josh and Colton to meet a man named Benjamin Cohen, one of the most inexplicable characters in this book. Chad never tells us what Benjamin Cohen's job or role is, other than Jewish leader. Does he work for the government? Does he work for the military? I assume most Jewish religious leaders are rabbis, but he doesn't seem to be a rabbi. All we ever learn about him is that he's Orthodox, and he's a direct descendant of Levi. Oh, and this. Benjamin nodded. I have a great respect for your church. I visited many times with your professors from BYU, and I understand your history. More importantly, I understand that we need to work together to accomplish our goals. No idea why he's so interested in the LDS church. He says we a lot, but never explains who we is. Like, for all practical purposes, it's all of the Jewish people in Israel. That's how he functions in this story, as a sort of senetasche for all Jewish people. Benjamin tells him that we have plans to rebuild Solomon's temple, that they even have the stones already cut to build it. But they can't build the temple because there is a Muslim shrine called the Dome of the Rock currently sitting where the temple is supposed to go. And yes, it's very important that the temple go in this one specific place, according to the Bible. So, pretty safe bet they're going to get rid of the Dome of the Rock at some point in this series. Just a heads up. Benjamin says he's hoping that a man named Elias will be able to help. How? I don't know, and it's never explained. But Josh gets all excited when he hears Elias's name. Josh was genuinely astonished that Benjamin was acquainted with Elias of Syria, a peace-loving, captivating man who had emerged out of nowhere 2 years before the coalition attack to become a worldwide sensation for his message of global harmony. And yet, the coalition still formed and attacked, so I don't know how successful he was. Benjamin says that Elias is in Jerusalem and offers to introduce Josh and Cohen to him, although he and Josh have actually met briefly once before. I want to point out, however, the failures of this scene from a technical writing perspective. John said that after Josh and Colton met with Benjamin Cohen, they'd be able to walk around the city freely instead of hiding in the back of a flatbed tricycle. Nothing in the scene makes that happen. They don't even talk about it. There is a difference between an author's motivations and a character's motivations. In fact, I would go so far as to say that in the majority of scenes, those motivations aren't the same. And the really tricky part is that a character's motivations should be usually fairly apparent. But an author's motivations should be, if not secret, at least only thoughtfully revealed. Not only does Chad consistently allow his motivations as an author to drive the scene, he frequently fails to bother including motivations for his characters. Here, Chad's motivation is to get Josh and Colton to meet Elias. But Josh and Colton's motivations is supposedly to protect Israel, and I don't see how meeting Benjamin Cohen helps them accomplish that, let alone meeting Elias. I suspect that Chad is so mentally enmeshed with his characters that he can't tell the difference between his own motivation and theirs. It's worth working out. Thus ends chapter 2. Back in New Jerusalem, the prophet has ordered everyone to watch a live stream. So Tad, Emma, their kids, Doug, Becky, their kids, and Mark and Michelle have all gathered together to watch. And no, there is no reason to have that many characters in this scene. The prophet makes a speech, first of many in this book, and announces that he believes God wants them to rebuild a number of cities in the Rocky Mountains, and he reads a long list of cities. He invites anyone who used to live in these cities to move back and start fixing things up. Doug is very excited to return to Springville. Tad has just been made a bishop of his ward, so he and Emma are going to be staying in New Jerusalem. Mark is stoked to go to Utah, but Michelle says she needs to pray about it. Mark looked a little surprised at his wife's remark. For him, it wasn't even a question. He was admittedly feeling a little restless in Zion. He had loved their assignment to help the Ute tribe bring the sacred gold to Zion, and while he enjoyed serving as an ordnance worker in the temple each afternoon, the thought of helping rebuild Utah really excited him. I guess we'll need to talk about it, Mark said carefully. Michelle gave him a stern look. Just last week, the doctor told you it was time to take it easy and slow down. How does restoring a city fit into that? Doug and Emma smiled across the room at each other, enjoying their parents' little spat. Enjoying their parents' little spat? I have to admit, I don't enjoy watching my parents disagree. I didn't know that was something I could take pleasure in. Anyway, as usual, the church is breaking up families. Michelle's eyes got a little misty. I'm just frustrated. I really thought that the one place I'd get to settle down with my kids and my grandkids nearby would be in New Jerusalem. Mark and Michelle pray about it, and God tells them to go back to Utah. There's a noticeable parallel between this scene and one from Chad's life. Here, Mark wants to move out of state to build a city of light, and Michelle doesn't want to, so she prays about it and God tells her to go. In 2015, Chad told Tammy that he wanted to move out of state to a city of refuge, and Tammy didn't want to, so she prayed about it and God told her to go. Now, I don't know if that last part is true. Chad claims that in his autobiography. He says he had a vision that they were going to move to Idaho, and then he accidentally referenced it in front of Tammy. This is from Living on the Edge of Heaven. A couple of weeks later, as we were eating dinner, the following words slipped out of my mouth. When we moved to Rexburg, I didn't finish the sentence because I saw the look on Tammy's face. She loudly said, "What?" Things got a little tense after that, but I explained the feelings I'd been having and how I wasn't sure how all of the projects would fit together. I said, maybe it won't happen for a year or two. Forget I said anything. Tammy wasn't thrilled, and I completely understood her feelings. Moving to Idaho would be a major undertaking that would uproot us from our families. I didn't bring it up again. Then, after a few weeks, Tammy felt impressed by the spirit that we should at least look into moving. We had learned from past experience that if we were supposed to move, things would fall into place almost magically. If we weren't supposed to move yet, nothing would work out. Things would fall into place magically. Huh? And the part where your brother and his wife asked you not to move to Rexburg, and if you did, to please not move into their ward, and if you did, then for heaven's sake, to please not move down the street from them. That was all things magically falling into place. The more I learn about Chad, the less I believe anything in his autobiography is true. I'm skeptical that this is how it really went down, but I don't know. What I do know is that in the same way that Chad stole ideas from other people to put in his stories, he seems to have stolen ideas from his stories to then try to put into his own life, or to at least claim were part of his own life. I'm sure he mentally reframed the whole thing as, oh, I had this premonition, blah, blah, blah. But I doubt much of it really happened. Thus ends chapter 3. Back in Jerusalem, Josh and Colton return to their dorm room full of apples, and Josh fills Colton in on Elias's past. Basically, he's a very popular spiritual teacher who's made a couple of prophecies that came true. I did a little research on the name Elias and didn't come up with anything, but I kept getting this feeling that the character reminded me of something, and finally I realized it was Eckhart Tolle. Eckhart Tolle is a New Age spiritual teacher who was born in Germany and I believe now lives in Canada, I think. And he wrote a huge bestseller called The Power of Now, which I admit to having read 4 times. It's a good book, okay? The ideas aren't original, but they're engagingly presented. And if you like mindfulness and you like New Age stuff, you'll probably love it. Anyway, Tolle recounts in his book how when he was in grad school, he fell into a very deep depression. And then one night he had this spiritual epiphany about being present in the moment, and he basically walked away from his life. He went and sat in a park bench in London for 2 years. I think he ended up living on the park bench. And people began coming over and talking to him, and he started sharing insights about his spiritual epiphany. And eventually he became a spiritual teacher, and he wrote this book, followed by a number of others. Now, listen to Chad's description of Elias's rise to fame. While he was in New York, he started making those prophetic statements, and his fellow college students rallied around him. He proclaimed himself a vegetarian and celibate, and he said he was on Earth to prepare the way for a great change that was coming. He really caught the media's attention when he moved into a large tent in Central Park, where thousands of his followers would go to hear his latest sermons. Once he started living in the tent, he dressed only in robes and sandals, which added to his mystique. Is it just me, or are those 2 origin stories somewhat similar? Plus, it sticks out to me that both names begin with E. I wasn't sure how Chad would be familiar with Eckhart Tolle, though, until I went to Wikipedia to confirm my memory of Eckhart Tolle's origin story, when I discovered something I had forgotten, which is just how much Oprah loves The Power of Now. She had Eckhart Tolle on her show repeatedly. She's still inviting him onto her radio show. She's still promoting his work. I think she pretty recently declared The Power of Now one of her 7 super soulful reads. And we know that Chad claimed that Oprah is the darkest spirit on the planet. Dr. John at Hidden True Crime theorizes that Chad hates Oprah because she's the high priestess of the Church of the Best Self, someone who claims that you can be happy without slavish devotion to religion. Obviously, that's not something Chad wants to hear. I would add to that Chad is a racist, but my point is that if Oprah is the high priestess of the Church of the Best Self, the Power of Now is certainly one of its scriptures. Maybe not equivalent to the Bible or the Book of Mormon, but at least Pearl of Great Price. I mean, it's got to be up there with that. It's very clear to me, too, why Chad would hate this book. It teaches that you can find inner happiness and peace without obedience to external authority. It says nothing about modesty or gender roles or white clothing. I am throwing out a completely unverified theory here that Chad based Elias on Eckhart Tolle. And spoiler alert, Elias is going to turn out to be the antichrist. Eckhart Tolle is the antichrist. Now, there is one issue with my theory, and that's what comes next, which makes it clear that Eckhart Tolle wasn't the person Chad was imagining when he wrote Elias. At least, not physically. Wow, this guy must be very charismatic, Colton said. He is, and he's also a bit of a showman, Josh reflected. At the time, members of the media were comparing Elias's physical traits to that of New York Yankees baseball star Alex Rodriguez. Even though Alex was older and reaching the end of his playing career, the two shared the same tall, muscular build, olive skin, and powerful smile. It was uncanny, and the late-night comedians had a heyday comparing photos of the two of them. They even both had green eyes. The only difference was the length of their hair, with Elias's ponytail reaching down past his shoulders compared to A-Rod's close-cropped trim. Apparently, Chad was imagining Alex Rodriguez when he wrote Elias. He goes on about Alex Rodriguez and Elias for a full page. My first thought was that Alex Rodriguez was another person Chad felt deserved the title Antichrist. But this reads like a fanboy's Tumblr post, and it just gets weirder as it goes. Rodriguez doesn't like being compared to Elias for some reason. They develop a public feud. And then guess who gets involved to settle things? Then Donald Trump arranged for a nationally televised meeting between the two of them at Yankee Stadium. Elias even agreed to take some batting practice with A-Rod, and when Elias hit a home run in his robe and sandals, the media went wild, proclaiming it the miracle in the Bronx. Why is Donald Trump in this book? How random is it that you have Donald Trump, Alex Rodriguez, and a version of Eckhart Tolle in the same scene? By the way, if you aren't aware, Chad did not shed a single tear during an entire day of victim impact statements. Not even when 6 of his former in-laws talked about his late wife. But he openly wept when discussing the miracle of Trump's election. That's the guy who wrote these books. Anyway, unexpected Trump cameo aside, what is going on in this scene? Why is it here? And the truth is, I don't know, but I have some guesses. My first guess is that Chad didn't hire editors for these books. He and Tammy did it themselves, and they occasionally hired proofreaders, who, by the way, didn't do that great a job either. My second guess is that Chad just really wanted to put Rodriguez in here. He loves sports. And my third guess is that he has conflicted feelings about Alex Rodriguez. No, not those kinds of conflicted feelings. I don't think he harbors a secret love for A-Rod. I think he both judges and admires Rodriguez. I think he admires Rodriguez for his sports ability and dislikes him for having been caught cheating and also for being generally kind of an immature person, which he does include here. Like, Rodriguez doesn't behave super well in this scene. As for why he used Rodriguez as a physical model for Elias, Eckhart Tolle is a very wise man, but like most of us, he was not gifted with physical perfection. I suspect Chad felt that Elias was much more likely to become a global leader if he was really good looking. Personally, I'd take Tolle any day, but that's me. Alright, enough about Chad and Tolle and A-Rod and Trump. Statistically improbable sentence, that one. Josh describes to Colton how some years ago, He attended an event where Elias was speaking and got a chance to meet him at like a meet and greet event, and he found Elias to be honest and sincere. Colton asks why Elias would be in Israel, and Josh says, "I'm not sure," Josh replied. "Benjamin had mentioned Elias was somehow protecting the country from being destroyed. I guess we'll find out tomorrow." We don't find out tomorrow. They don't even ask. The next day, Josh and Colton go to meet Benjamin Cohen and Elias. I don't know where John is. He must have teleported somewhere. He doesn't appear in most of this book. He's just off doing work for Jesus, I guess. I'm not really sure. Elias informs Josh and Colton and Benjamin Cohen that he's planning on leaving Israel that afternoon, which concerns Benjamin Cohen, and he says, "I must admit, I'm fearful of what might happen when the other nations know you've left." Elias shook his head. "You'll be safe. Besides, you now have these apostles here to assist you." Colton detected a hint of sarcasm in Elias's response. He looked over at Josh to see his reaction, but his fellow apostle was still seemingly mesmerized by the man. I'm still not clear on how Elias's presence is protecting Israel. The only explanation that makes sense based on the text is that Israel's enemies like Elias so much that they won't risk hurting him by attacking Israel while he's there. I really don't know if that's something militaries consider. I kind of think not, but, might be. After the meeting, Josh and Colton discuss Elias. Josh shook his head. "Maybe it's just me, but when I looked into his eyes this morning, something was different." "In what way?" Josh stammered a little, trying to put it into words. "It wasn't necessarily a darkness within him, but more of a worldliness and arrogance. The young Elias I met in Nebraska had the innocence of a baby fawn, but the man we met today didn't have that same countenance. Frankly, it makes me a little nervous." This is not good writing. I know Chad can't understand this, but innocence isn't actually something people look for in a spiritual teacher, because it suggests lack of experience. If I imagine someone as innocent as a fawn, I don't imagine that's a person I want to turn to in search of wisdom and advice. Also, Elias is a grown man, and comparing him to a baby fawn is a little bit weird. But Chad doesn't understand people, and he's attempting to write a character who's much more sophisticated than he is, and he can't do it. Elias never makes any sense as a character. Thus ends chapter 4. In Moscow, Bulgarian double agent Mitko Petrov is invited to attend a meeting of the coalition leaders. As Mitko sat there, he realized he'd been blessed with the gift of interpretation of tongues. Now he doesn't even have to pray for the gift of tongues, the name of which has been changed to the gift of the interpretation of tongues. I don't remember seeing that one in the Bible. A man described only as the Russian leader gets up and recounts how the coalition invasion was assisted by unnamed American politicians. He gives an example. "When our battleships moved into position in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, we should have never been able to get so close to their shores. Thankfully for us, those leaders purposely caused a lot of confusion and doubt about how America should respond. These distractions affected the decisions of the U.S. military advisors at crucial times, and their hesitation bought us just enough time to accomplish our goals. Otherwise, our invasion never could have happened." That's not how I remember it happening in the Great Gathering. I don't remember any evidence of confusion or distraction. I'm not going to beat around the bush. I don't think Chad came up with this storyline until he started writing this book. I think people pointed out that the president's behavior in the Great Gathering was bizarre, and Chad tried to shore up his plotting with this explanation. Are we supposed to believe that the president of the U.S. was a Russian double agent? I know that's the sort of thing Ezra Taft Benson would believe, but not me. Someone else at the meeting logically asks who these American leaders were. The Russian waved his hand. Their names don't matter now, and you can see we don't have any Americans among us. Frankly, they were fools to believe we'd ever include them in our group. If they could so easily betray their own country, how could we expect them to stay true to us? That's why we hit certain parts of Washington, D.C. so hard at the beginning of the invasion. We knew where their offices were, so we eliminated them first. Much to their surprise, I'm sure. How convenient for both the coalition and for Chad's plotting Band-Aid. Except, I'm pretty sure he specifically said that they didn't bomb D.C., that D.C. was just abandoned. Mitko is invited to share his experiences in America with the group. He wraps up by explaining how America is stronger than ever, which is not only a lie, since America no longer exists, but probably also a stupid thing to announce in a room full of world leaders who hate America. The Russian, whom I assume Chad didn't name because he didn't want this to be considered a prediction that could be proven wrong later when someone else came to lead Russia, uses Mitko's assessment to argue that instead of attacking America again, the coalition should focus on getting the UK, Israel, and the Scandinavian countries to join them. Thus ends Chapter 5. Mark, Michelle, Doug, Becky, and their 3 kids return to Springville, Utah, and we get 3 pages of them talking about houses. Houses continue to be of primary importance in these books. The bishop basically tells everyone to take whichever house they want. I was wondering how we'll handle property ownership, Mark said. What if someone comes here in the spring and another family is now living in their old house? The bishop tells him that all previous claims to a home are invalid. The other unspoken factor in rebuilding the city is that this is a test of commitment for the saints, Bishop Schultz said. We both know there are some Springville families who stayed in New Jerusalem with the full intent to come here once winter is over, after we've done all of the hard work. That's fine, but should they have the right to kick someone out of their old home and move in when they get here? I don't think so, Mark replied. I feel if a family chose not to come with this first group, then they forfeit their claim to their house. The general authorities agree with you, the bishop said. I just realized how much Mark sounds like Emma in this chapter. So, even though these people have already given up everything they owned, moved 1,000 miles away, spent several years doing manual labor 6 days a week, they're still being given tests of faith. They're still being forced to prove themselves. And if they pass the test, they get a house. Doug and Becky choose a house, and we have to hear about that. Then Becky finds an old newspaper article about how the Mormons have all lost their minds and run off into the mountains, which was written after the call-out, but before the coalition invasion. That's some really objective reporting, Becky said to herself. Yep, we were the crazy ones. Because it matters who's right. She's not done, though. She finds copies of People and TV Guide. Becky had often read both magazines, but now she realized how shallow and trivial those things really had been. The beautiful people partied right to the end, she said sadly. I wonder how many of them are even alive now. She burns both magazines in the fireplace. Then there's a bunch of pointlessness involving Doug. Thus ends Chapter 6. There is nothing in Chapter 7 worth discussing. As the new year began at the Kremlin, Mitko Petrov was becoming increasingly integrated into the coalition membership. For whatever reason, the Russian leader had really developed a fondness for him, saying Mitko reminded him of himself when he was young. For whatever reason, huh? For what reason? Whatever reason. So Mitko is now a high-ranking politician in the Kremlin, which I guess is why he's present when Elias arrives to address the coalition leaders. Elias says there are 2 LDS apostles in Israel, and they have to be eliminated. He doesn't explain why they're a threat, though. He just says they have a tangible power he's never felt before. Then he proposes they destroy Israel, like you do. Chad seems to go out of his way in this book to avoid admitting that anti-Semitism might be a motivating factor for coalition members, even though that avoidance becomes glaringly distracting, even though Elias is never able to explain why else they should destroy Israel. And here's the thing, I know Israel is a hot-button topic, always, but especially now. I am not making any sort of statement or argument about Israel or Gaza or anything other than the writing here. So please keep that in mind. I'm talking about what I believe Chad's views are here. I think Chad is a conspiracy theorist, and at the heart of every conspiracy theory is anti-Semitism. What I see in his writing is a simultaneous desire to avoid admitting the existence of anti-Semitism and to allude to anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. So, for example, this is what Elias says. I am indeed a peace-loving man, but I see how the elimination of Israel and these apostles would actually bring sustained peace to the world. I read this, and the first thing I heard in my head was Mel Gibson saying that a certain group of people are responsible for all the wars in the world. Obviously, that's not true, but that's what Elias is implying here. Otherwise, how would getting rid of Israel bring sustained peace to the world? This sounds like a dog whistle to me. There's another one on the page before, and I didn't even recognize this one. My partner pointed it out after I read him this section and asked him if Chad was really this stupid. Again, this is Elias talking. For the most part, the Jews are a unified people, Elias said. They're confident that their God will protect them, and I think we all agree that they've had an amazing streak of luck over the past few decades. There's no logical explanation for Israel's survival, and yet they continue to prosper. There seems to be some kind of reference here to the idea of a worldwide Jewish conspiracy. I don't know why a writer would dog whistle to anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists while pretending anti-Semitism doesn't exist, unless he is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist. And if you think Chad isn't a conspiracy theorist, wait till we get to his last series. But my point is, you can't write about an international coalition deciding to destroy Israel without acknowledging anti-Semitism. And not only does Chad attempt that, but he has no creativity, so he can't come up with another reason that the coalition would want to destroy Israel. Instead, he just throws in these dog whistles, and anti-Semitism ends up being the elephant in the room. I'm going to read the rest of this excerpt, which ends the chapter. I'll reread the part I read a moment ago. I am indeed a peace-loving man, but I see how the elimination of Israel and these apostles would actually bring sustained peace to the world. I'm certain that after a damaging attack, any Israeli survivors would be humbled enough to finally join the coalition. He paused before adding, there are times when force is required to create peace. These comments were first met with silence, but then a smattering of applause grew into a steady roar. The Russian and Iranian leaders were seated side by side, and they smiled and nodded at each other. The Iranian leaned over and whispered to his friend, if we can shift the blame for attacking Israel onto Elias, then what are we waiting for? Thus ends chapter whichever. After the coalition leaders agree to blow up a country, everyone heads outside for an alfresco banquet. Mitko is chowing down when he gets a text message from God. Go to your room now and block any openings, a voice told him. Isn't it neat how everyone in these stories experiences God in exactly the same way? Apparently Mitko has been given a one-bedroom apartment, as a high-ranking coalition official, so he goes to it and barricades the door and crams blankets in all the door and window cracks. Moments later, an enormous swarm of horseflies envelops the city and attacks everyone. Someone beats on the apartment door, but Mitko hides under his covers and doesn't come out until the next day. He went down into his building's lobby expecting turmoil, but he wasn't prepared for the scene before him. Hundreds of people were lying on the lobby floor, all of them with horrible bite marks on their faces, necks, and arms. Many of the wounds were already filled with pus and clearly infected. Yes, that's what pus means. It means infection. He goes to the Russian leader's house, and for some reason he's ushered right into the bedroom. I guess he's now also the Russian's best friend. It's just him and a housekeeper, too, so maybe everyone else is dead. Mitko was ushered into the Russian's bedroom, and he tried not to gasp. The leader's head was one large oozing sore, and his eyes were nearly swollen shut. Some of the sores had already developed tiny maggots from eggs laid by the flies. Come on, dude. At some point in the future, I'd like to be able to eat again. The next day, people start dying from the horsefly bites, and Mitko gets stuck helping bury bodies. At least they bury them and don't just chuck them in the Moskva River. Thus ends chapter 9. In Jerusalem, Josh and Colton's dorm is attacked by the horseflies. For some reason, God didn't include them in the group text warning about this. Josh gets bitten repeatedly and starts to swell up, but Colton gives him a priesthood blessing, and the bites heal within seconds. Like Mitko, the apostles conclude that this must be a plague sent by God. All of their clothing burned up when John crashed their plane, and they've been borrowing clothes from Benjamin Cohen, so Colton ransacks the other dorm rooms and returns with white shirts and tan pants. The prophet asked all of the apostles to wear light-colored clothing in public, and I feel we should do our best to still follow that counsel here in Jerusalem, Colton said. So the city has been attacked by horseflies. They've been watching through a pair of binoculars as people on the street writhe in pain. But rather than do anything to help, their first priority is finding white clothing. They go to Benjamin Cohen's house, but his family won't let them in. They speak to a woman at the door, and Josh says, "We could come in and give him a blessing of comfort." "Comfort?" she asked with a shake of her head. "Some people think that you two are the cause of the flies." The apostles looked at each other in surprise. "Us? We're here to bless the people, not hurt them." "I don't know. We were safe while Elias was here. Now that he has left and you have arrived, this terrible plague has come upon us. Is that just a coincidence?" Yes, of course it's a coincidence. What does she think, that they came into town with giant plastic bins full of horseflies? That they're the beastmasters of insects? Who even knows Josh and Colton are in town, other than Benjamin Cohen and John, who disappeared chapters ago? Josh and Colton are disappointed, and they walk past a park on their way home. All of the children had been severely attacked by the flies and were lying on the ground in misery. John looked into the eyes of an Israeli girl who had bites all over her face. "Where are your parents?" he asked her. "They've left us here to go take care of themselves," she said. Nope. Don't buy it. Yes, there are selfish people in the world, and maybe one or two parents would have bailed, but an entire park full of children? No. If there is one thing that binds the human race together, it's that people everywhere love their kids. Lori and Chad are the exceptions, although I'm sure Chad believes everyone is secretly like him. I don't know if he wrote this because of projection or anti-Semitism, or simply because it was convenient for his plot, but it's stupid and I find it offensive. Josh gives the girl a priesthood blessing and she's instantly healed. Then he and Colton start blessing everyone in sight, and a huge mob develops, so they spend hours healing people. Eventually, the woman who sent them away from Benjamin Cohen's house shows up, all shamefaced, and apologizes. She looked a bit embarrassed. "Mr. Cohen has awakened and has heard about the healings you're doing. He wants you to visit him. I'm sorry about what I told you earlier. He doesn't believe you caused the flies. That was my own belief, but now I know I was wrong. They were right, she was wrong. They go back to Benjamin Cohen's house. I've been watching you, he told them. I've never seen anything like it in my life. You truly possess the power of God. Colton nodded. That's the whole reason we're here, to help you and your people fulfill the promises made by the prophets. Benjamin smiled. Then would it be all right if you gave me a blessing as well? I feel miserable. I like how Benjamin Cohen says, you truly possess the power of God, and Colton just nods, like, yeah. I'm not sure which prophets Colton is referencing here. They could be Jewish prophets, or they could be LDS prophets. Benjamin Cohen doesn't seem too concerned, but I want to know what it means that he and the rest of the Jewish people are going to fulfill promises made by someone else. They spend all day healing people and then go back to the dorm, where John the Beloved visits them for the first time in 8 chapters. And what does he bring them? Several sets of light-colored clothing, including a white suit for each of them. Why is this so important to Chad? I don't get it. I was disappointed to see in his new mugshot that his prison uniform is apparently yellow. Now, I think the color is way too bright to satisfy him, but I was really hoping he'd get stuck in navy blue, or maybe even black and white stripes. Oh, and as an aside, I don't think he's smiling in that picture. I know there's been so much debate on that. It looks to me like somebody just took the photo before he was ready. He isn't even, facing straight forward in it. Just my 2 cents. Thus ends chapter 10. Doug comes home one day and discovers that Jonas has moved to Springville because he wants to start a car recycling plant there. Jonas, you might recall, is the one who didn't lead a massacre because a telepathic baby told him that Jesus says not to hate babies. Then that telepathic baby dies. It happens entirely without warning. Becky hears Daniel crying in pain in the first paragraph of the page, and by the end of the page he's dead. It sounds like maybe 5 to 10 minutes have passed. As previously with Daniel, there's confusion about whether or not he's suffering. Daniel was turning blue and was twisting and turning in agony. That sounds like suffering to me, but Doug gives him a priesthood blessing that says, I bless you that your release from this mortal body will be without pain. Only Daniel continues to gasp for air and then dies, so as an asthmatic, I can tell you that not being able to breathe is a form of suffering. Chad dedicates the next 5 pages to people mourning Daniel, which is a lot of pages for Chad. No one's actually mourning, though. They're just sort of going through the motions. Who does that sound like? First, Jonas rips up some cupboards to build Daniel a coffin, and then we go to Daniel's funeral. Instead of giving a traditional eulogy, Doug recounts why Daniel had physical deformities. And then this random guy from Escape to Zion, Jason, gets up and tells how one night he was sleeping in the cemetery and witnessed one of the prophets being resurrected. His point is that resurrection is real, and that Daniel will one day be resurrected. But it seems like he's kind of making Daniel's funeral about himself. And then the bishop starts talking about how all the previous prophets were in attendance at the dedication of the new temple in New Jerusalem, and he wondered at the time if they'd been resurrected. But after hearing Jason's story, he figures they probably were. This, A, has nothing to do with Daniel, and B, can't be accurate because resurrected beings have solid bodies, and the former prophets didn't walk into the dedication ceremony. They just sort of appeared out of thin air. I went back to that scene and checked. Finally, Daniel's son Justin says he's going to miss his little brother, and that's about as good as the eulogies get. Between this and Chad's offensive comments at Tammy's funeral, and Kim's comments about her friend Nicole's family reunion at Tina's funeral in Chasing Paradise, it's clear that Chad fundamentally doesn't understand the purpose of a eulogy. Then we jump to the point of view of Daniel's spirit. He's there at his own funeral, because he's going to need to know where his body is when it gets resurrected. He was eager to begin some assignments he had already been given to help prepare the world for the second coming, but he paused for a moment to reflect on what he had learned during his 3 years inside of that deformed mortal body. As one of the most valiant of Heavenly Father's spirit children, he had been given the opportunity to come to Earth in a situation that would serve as a teaching moment for him and also for his family as they learned humility in dealing with physical challenges. For narcissists, Chad is really fixated on making people humble themselves. Not him, other people. Daniel had one arm, a deformed leg, facial deformities, poor hearing, poor vision, and he never learned to talk. I am not saying that his life wasn't worth living. I am, however, saying that that's a lot to deal with. And I take issue with the word humility here. I mean, how are we supposed to interpret it in this context? I could see where maybe if we're applying it to Daniel, it could mean that God wanted him to learn to ask for help. I'm being generous there. But if Doug and Becky needed to learn humility, that implies that having a disabled child was embarrassing or even shameful for them. That's a problem. Interestingly, in his book, The Youth of Zion, which is religious advice for Mormon teens, Chad has an entire chapter on humility, but nothing in it actually discusses humility. I don't think Chad knows what humility is. He seems to confuse it with humiliation, which is somewhat understandable given that they share a root, but he's a writer. He should know what fairly common words mean. Humility, however, was Daniel's secondary life goal. He had always been aware of his key earthly assignment, to evoke a sense of compassion in Jonas on that crucial night in Manti, and he was grateful he had been able to fulfill it. So the purpose of his life was just to freak Jonas out. Daniel and his ancestors have lots of work to do in the spirit world, so they go back through the veil and get to work. Thus ends chapter 11. It was a somber February day for the Daltons as they pondered life without Daniel, but by afternoon, Doug knew his son wouldn't want him moping around. By afternoon, he was already finished grieving his child? That's mind-blowing. As we've seen many times before, Chad doesn't want people to grieve. He just wants them to move on. I was listening to Dr. John talk about Corey Richens, who poisoned her husband and then wrote a children's book about grieving. And he was saying that everything she does is actually intended to minimize grief. Dr. John said that psychopaths have a hard time feeling grief, and so they find it irritating in others. And I thought, that's Chad. That's what he's doing in these stories when people die and immediately afterward, everyone moves on. And I think that's also why he tries to prevent his readers from feeling sadness or pity. He always seems to be saying, don't be sad. You're missing my point about how death doesn't matter if you're a good Mormon. But I think he's the one missing the point. So Doug moves on. He has a talk with Jason, who has somehow become a major character for these 3 chapters, about the fate of people who didn't heed the call out. Now, Jason was a maintenance missionary, which means that instead of going to the camps during the call out, he was assigned to continue doing maintenance around the temples and kind of being the church's eyes and ears on the street. So he saw what happened to people who didn't heed the call out. This is what he tells Doug about it. Many of them moved into homes near the Payson Temple, but it was strange for me to see these people cluster around the temple like that. These were the same people who had ignored the words of the prophet when he told them to gather to the mountain camps. And how dare they gather near temples when they failed their test of faith? Naturally, Doug shares Emma's obsession with being right or wrong. I guess these people recognized they hadn't done what they should have. A little too late, Doug said. I wish they would have just come to the camps. We were very cautious about who we let in, but if they were sincere, we would have given them a second chance. That is not true. That is a flat-out lie. They weren't letting people into the camps. There were scenes of the church ignoring people when they came to the temples for help. They said specifically on the day of the call-out, if you don't come now, you can't come later. I think it was a matter of pride, Jason said. They couldn't admit they were wrong, but these people had no clue how to live without a well-stocked grocery store down the street. It's too bad they didn't have disabled sons to teach them humility. Jason continues. That's when some families went to live in Lincoln Point, where they at least could catch fish to survive. That's not much of a life, Doug said. Exactly, especially after having nice homes and cars, all kinds of techno gadgets, and plenty of food. I spied on the city a few weeks after the families moved there, and it wasn't pretty. The kids were blaming their parents for the situation they were in. They had actually divided into two groups, the adults versus the children. Soon their anger boiled over into bloodshed, and it wasn't long before there weren't any adults left. They were so unhappy living on fish that the children turned on their parents and slaughtered the adults, just like in Children of the Corn. Jonas meets up with Angie's son Tom, who, to my great sorrow, is not secretly evil. And the two of them drive a truck full of fruits and vegetables to Lincoln Point, where 90% of the teenagers immediately decide to give up their Peter Pan lifestyle and move back to town. It's so unexciting. Jonas just says, hey, do you guys want to live normal lives again? And the kids are like, yeah, whatever, I'm sick of fishing anyway. The young people are then quickly stripped of their identity and integrated into the dystopia. Over the next couple of days, each of the kids who had come from Lincoln Point were given new clothes, haircuts, and plenty of food. I assume those are modest, light-colored clothes and above-the-ear haircuts. Bishop Schultz and Doug did sit down and talk with each of them, and the men were pleased to see that nearly all of the kids had been humbled by their experiences. They promised to keep the laws of the city and were just happy to have a sense of normalcy back into their lives. Well, I guess any experience has value if you come out of it humbled. One of the kids who abandons Lincoln Point is Tara, whom we met in Escape to Zion. She was the one running the hideout where Emma and Heather stayed. In this version, she moves in with Doug and Becky, and they promise to help her find her parents in New Jerusalem. I want to add a quick note about Becky here. In Escape to Zion, we learned that she and Daniel died 6 days apart. That never happens in this book. Becky doesn't die. I don't know why not, and Chad never explains, so yeah, go Becky, I guess. That ends chapter 12. Mark and Michelle Dalton drive Tara to Emma's house in New Jerusalem so that she can meet back up with her parents. There's a reunion scene, and it's directly adapted from the one in Escape to Zion. I suspect what Chad did was literally cut and paste from the Escape to Zion Word document and put it in the Keys of the Kingdom document and then make minor changes. I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs in order to explain how close the writing is. In the second excerpt, I've put the words that were changed or added in blue. This is from the original Escape to Zion. Mike waved his hand. Tara, don't talk that way. We love you and can barely express how happy we are to see you again. This is a dream come true. Heather and I stayed a few minutes longer, and we realized Tara was an only child. I couldn't begin to imagine the pain Mike and Samantha must have endured every day for the past several years. But I could see that torment ebb away as they chatted with Tara. The prodigal daughter had miraculously returned. Here's the version in Keys of the Kingdom. Mike hastily waved his hand. Tara, don't talk that way. We love you and can barely express how happy we are to see you again. This is a dream come true. Mark and Michelle joined them in their living room for a few minutes as Tara explained to her parents what had happened to her the past couple of years. Tara was an only child, and Emma could only begin to imagine the pain Mike and Samantha must have endured every day since Tara disappeared from their lives. But that anguish was ebbing away as they chatted with Tara. The prodigal daughter had miraculously returned. Chad did the bare minimum when adapting this scene. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason for what's different and what's the same between this timeline and the one in Escape to Zion. He specified that Angie and Tom ended up as good Mormons because Emma had a spiritual experience and reached out to them. But why did Doug's mission as one of the 144,000 priests end so early? Why didn't Becky die? I'm chalking it all up to Chad's whims. Tad informs Emma that the missionaries who were teaching the members of the 10 tribes have been released, so their son David will be home soon, and she's happy. David comes home, and the family and would-be girlfriend Phyllis turn out to welcome him. Charles invites David and Phyllis to come help landscape for a day. Thus ends chapter 13. In a different part of New Jerusalem, Kim Brown looked at a framed photo of her husband Josh that was next to her bed. She wiped away some tears, surprised at how much she was struggling with his absence this time. Part of the difficulty was that she hadn't been able to speak with him since the day he left. She'd felt some anxiety when Josh was gone helping the lost 10 tribes travel to Zion, but that assignment was straightforward, and she had always felt assured he would return safely. She wasn't so confident this time. See, this is where Chad is making me crazy. Why wouldn't Josh have told Kim, "I'm going to die"? Why didn't he warn her? What kind of terrible husband is he? Then Kim gets an email from her parents, Frank and Miriam. Yeah, Chad changed Carmen's name to Miriam. She seems to be the same character. She's still from Peru. She just has a different name now. Maybe the real Carmen Marlar protested the use of her names? I mean, we know Chad names all of his characters after real people. Maybe he and Carmen had a falling out and he was like, "I'm just gonna scratch you right out of here." Like that time Beethoven scratched Napoleon's name off the top of one of his pieces. She seems to be the same character, and other than that, I don't know what to tell you, but her name's Miriam now. I have never read another series where a character's name just changed between books. So Miriam, sends Kim an email about how she was recently visited by the ghost of Kim's sister Tina, who died when she was a teenager. Tina told her that there are thousands of Miriam's ancestors who are anxious to have their temple work done, because they're all in spirit prison and they've all accepted Mormonism and now they want to go to paradise. Miriam told Tina to contact Kim directly. I guess she just decided she didn't want to deal with it. So that night, Kim has an out-of-body experience and visits with Tina in the spirit world. They go to that big auditorium where the orientation for the newly dead is held, and Kim learns that wise old baby Daniel has taken over leading the orientation session. I don't know where Grandpa Samuel went. They flew to one of the Inca temples on the outskirts of the city, and Tina led Kim to a room that held a desk and a computer. I'm used to Chad skipping setting descriptions, but now he's including setting descriptions that don't make any sense. There's a desk with a computer in an Incan temple? This requires some sort of explanation. I'm not saying you can't include it, but there needs to be justification or some context. I mean, where's the computer plugged in? Has the temple been wired up? And why doesn't Chad know that the adjectival form of Inca is Incan? Tina uses the computer to basically download thousands of genealogical records into Kim's brain. These are the records of their Peruvian ancestors, all of whom have converted to Mormonism's spirit prison and want their temple work done so they can go to paradise. Kim wakes up, remembers all the names, and starts typing them out. Thus ends chapter 14. Mitko has now become a gravedigger in Moscow. There's no other way to put it. He's gone from a high-ranking government official to a gravedigger. Apparently 4 million people died from the horsefly bites, including both the Russian and Iranian leaders, and everybody has just spent the last month burying them. I can only assume that Chad's description of how much Mitko hates his job is a reflection of how much Chad himself hated being a gravedigger. Now, however, Elias has been named the leader of the coalition, and he's asked Mitko to become his assistant and advisor. Mitko accepts, and they attend another big meeting of coalition leaders, where Elias implies that he'll achieve peace at any cost. The next scene is in Elias's point of view. It's the first one in his point of view. He returns to his apartment in Moscow, and who's waiting there for him? Satan. Elias recalls how he and Satan had met a few years before, and Satan had offered to make him the most powerful man on earth. Elias initially resisted his friend's offer, but soon his ego prevailed, and he decided to listen to the proposal. As they had talked, the opportunities this friend presented were so enticing that Elias didn't see how he could lose. I'm struck by Chad's use of the word enticements, which we saw him use to describe Lincoln Point in Escape to Zion. Satan and Elias are in disagreement over whether or not to push the coalition to attack Israel unprovoked. They decide to destroy the Dome of the Rock and frame the Israelis for it. Then they'll use this false flag operation as a justification to attack Israel. But Satan informs Elias that Mitko is a double agent, and they decide that they should somehow also frame Elias for the attack? It's a little confusing. Thus ends chapter 15. Josh and Colton are walking through Jerusalem when they see some missiles fly through the air and destroy the Dome of the Rock. Why the Iron Dome didn't catch the missiles, I don't know. Why Josh and Colton didn't use their priesthood powers to prevent the missiles from landing, I don't know. Instead, they run to the rubble, and Josh finally whips out his priesthood powers to move some rocks and save some children trapped underneath. Curiously, Colton doesn't seem to be able to move rocks. I mean, he doesn't try to here, but I would assume that's something he ought to be able to do. I thought he could do all the things Josh could do, but all he ever does in this book is heal people. And frankly, I think Chad just likes the idea of there being one super special person and no one can be as special as him. So even though there are supposed to be two apostles in this situation, only Josh is the special one. Colton's just, there to peel his apples for him. After rescuing and healing people, they go to see Benjamin Cohen. I still don't know what Benjamin Cohen's role in society is. All he seems to do is sit at home and wait for Josh and Colton to drop by. What information do you have about the attack? Josh asked. Who fired the missiles? Benjamin shook his head. We don't know, other than we're certain it wasn't us. But the problem is those missiles were launched from within our borders. Cool. How do you know that? Then he says everyone who isn't Jewish is leaving the country because they're afraid of a retaliatory strike. So is anybody staying? Colton asked. Well, as far as we can tell, only the Jews, because we don't have anywhere else to go. Chad, I don't know what logic he was using when he wrote this. I mean, most of us don't have another country lined up that we can just go to when the place we live in is troubled. If we did, America's population would have dropped by about half over the last 7-8 years. But the implication here is that nobody wants Jewish people in their country, which is obviously another anti-Semitic implication that Chad is trying to work into this story. And the fact that he puts it in the mouth of a Jewish character is outrageous. Josh tells Benjamin Cohen that he and Colton want to live on the Temple Mount, which is a hill with a plateau on top, and that's where the Dome of the Rock used to sit. He says that he and Colton need to live there so that they'll have a better view of the city, which will allow them to protect it better. Because I guess the reason they couldn't stop the missiles that blew up the Dome of the Rock was that they just didn't have a good enough view? I don't know. It doesn't make any sense to me. I don't think there are any apartments or houses or anything on the Temple Mount. But that's what they've decided to do. Thus ends chapter 16. Back in Russia, Elias goes to Mitko's apartment. Elias asks Mitko if he believes in Jesus, and Mitko admits that he does. Wrong answer. Elias grabbed Mitko roughly by the hair and slammed him to the floor. He put his knee in Mitko's chest and slapped him hard across the face. "Either deny Jesus Christ or die," Elias hissed as he pulled a small knife from his robe. "Jesus lives. I'll never deny it," Mitko said, his eyes bulging at the sight of the weapon. "Then I have no use for you." Elias quickly plunged the blade into Mitko's chest and twisted it through his heart. Mitko cried out in agony and tried to sit up, but then his head slumped to the floor. And that's it for Mitko. He's dead. Just like that. Also, this is kind of random, but I can't read this line about how Mitko can't deny Jesus without thinking of that Korihor phone call between Lori and Chad and Melanie Gibb, where Lori says, "And I will never deny it." That part just cracks me up. So Elias then pulls a letter out of his robe and puts it on Mitko's kitchen table and leaves. We jump to the point of view of Mitko's spirit. Mitko's spirit had left his body almost immediately after the knife penetrated his heart, sparing him prolonged pain. As with Daniel, Chad downplays the suffering of death. Here, he says it happened so fast it barely hurt, like a flu shot to the heart. Mitko reads the note that Elias left on his table, which is a forged letter from Mitko to Benjamin Cohen, saying, "Congrats on blowing up the Dome of the Rock." Mitko is somewhat confused because he has no idea who Benjamin Cohen is. Then Elias returns, this time with a bodyguard, and tells the bodyguard that he caught Mitko folding up a letter. When Mitko wouldn't tell him to whom the letter was addressed, Elias tried to take it from him, and Mitko lunged at him with a knife. They wrestled, he had no choice, blah, blah, blah. Personally, I don't see why Elias couldn't have just left Mitko's body to be discovered. The story he comes up with is dreadful, especially the part about demanding to see Mitko's letter. Who feels so strongly that they have the right to read another person's mail that they would actually try to snatch paper out of someone else's hand? Mitko watches as the bodyguard buries Mitko's body in a nearby vacant field, which he's going to have to locate again once the resurrection occurs. Then he witnesses a meeting of the coalition leadership in which Elias orders 100,000 soldiers to be assembled in Syria so they can attack Israel within a week. Thus ends chapter 17. Mitko teleports himself to the BYU Jerusalem dorm to talk to Josh. I didn't know spirits could teleport, and I don't know how he knew that Josh would be at the BYU Jerusalem dorm. "Josh, I need to talk to you," Mitko shouted, tapping Josh hard on the shoulder. Josh suddenly stood up straight and looked around. It almost felt like he had a mosquito buzzing in his ear, but then the buzzing formed into words. "Josh, this is Mitko Petrov," the voice said. "I've been killed, and I have a message for you." Josh turned to Colton and said, "We have a visitor. Let's sit quietly on the couch." What kind of reaction is this? Let's get clear about how abnormal this is. Josh hears that a good friend of his is dead, and he hears it from the friend's ghost. And his reaction isn't shock, isn't upset, isn't sadness. He doesn't start crying. He doesn't even gasp. His response is to say, "Let's sit quietly on the couch." Chad is literally telling us that the appropriate response to death is to sit down and shut up. So Josh and Colton sit quietly on the couch, and then Mitko materializes. I don't know what bothers me more, that we've never seen a spirit materialize in any of Chad's books before, or that Josh thinks they need to sit quietly on the couch in order to talk to the spirit. Mitko quickly assures Josh that his death doesn't matter. "I've been killed, but it was meant to be." He lets Josh and Colton know about the incipient invasion, and then, with his message delivered, Mitko began to fade away. Then, with a brief wave, he vanished. And that's it. Mitko's gone. He's been a character for 3 books, and then Chad discards him like a greasy pizza box. Josh never expresses any sorrow at Mitko's death. Neither does Mitko, for that matter. No one does. No one cares that Mitko is dead. Josh and Colton busy themselves, moving on to the Temple Mount, where they conveniently find a small building with 2 beds in it. I have no idea why there would be what amounts to an unlocked shed with beds in it that magically survived a bombing there. But they move in, pray, and they get their first house guest, Jesus, who floats in through the shack's ceiling. Jesus gives them the power to seal. If I understand correctly, this is the power to make promises and oaths permanent and binding in both heaven and on earth. I wasn't paying a lot of attention to that, though, because of this interaction between Josh and Jesus regarding what the new temple that they're going to build on the site of the Rock of the Dome is going to look like. This temple will resemble the previous Jewish temples, right? Josh asked. Yes, make sure the Jewish leaders build it after the manner described in the book of Ezekiel. Did Jesus just answer a question? I thought we established in the last book in this series that Jesus doesn't do interrogatives. And yet, he answers 3 different questions in this scene. I guess he only refuses to answer questions posed by the prophet? Or maybe just realized that his refusal to answer questions makes Jesus seem like a really weird dude and retconned that too. I don't know. After several unnecessary paragraphs about how the Israeli soldiers communicate by signaling each other with mirrors, Josh decides that the best way to prevent the coalition army from reaching Israel is to use the power of the priesthood to create an F5 tornado to scatter the troops. Sadly, we don't get to see the tornado and the troops meet. We just see Josh create it, and then there's a scene break, after which, somewhere in the desert, Elias surveys the damage and curses the apostles. Thus ends chapter 18. The tornado has killed 20,000 coalition soldiers, which is about 1/5 of the army, but Elias is determined to press on. Yes, we've suffered casualties, and we're now less equipped than we were, but we still have the element of surprise, Elias told them. Except that Elias blamed Josh and Colton only a page ago for the tornado. Obviously, if the apostles knew to send a tornado after the coalition army, they knew the army was on its way, so the element of surprise is already lost. Elias finally agrees to let the troops go back to Syria and regroup. Then Chad throws in a paragraph explaining how Elias couldn't just nuke Jerusalem because people would be upset that he destroyed so many historical sites, which kind of comes across as another plot hole band-aid. The next day, Josh tells Benjamin Cohen that God has told him it's time to rebuild the Jerusalem temple. I don't know if this is technically a lie or not. It was Jesus specifically who told him that. And I'm still not clear on how distinct the members of the Trinity are in Mormonism. Maybe Josh really does think that God and Jesus are the same, or maybe he just doesn't want to tell Benjamin Cohen that Jesus is the one who wants the temple rebuilt. Either way, Benjamin Cohen's excited because the Jewish people have been waiting to rebuild this temple since 70 AD. It's also in here because it's one of the things that the prophecies say has to happen before the second coming, which is Chad's interest. 3 days after that, the second of the 7 plagues from the book of Revelations arrives. Apparently the horseflies was the first one. This is Benjamin Cohen speaking to Josh. Something really strange is happening, he said with a worried look. We've been monitoring the radio transmissions from several coalition countries, and they're all reporting a strange event. They claim that the oceans have turned to blood. Now, we have a lot of characters at this point. Far more than we need, actually, in this series. So why couldn't at least one of them have been maneuvered into a situation near an ocean so that we could discover this plague in a scene? It would be so much more exciting than hearing about it secondhand. Also, now that Mitko is dead, Chad doesn't really have anything for any of the characters besides Josh, Colton, and Elias to do. Doug and Emma and their families are just sitting around in their white outfits, twiddling their thumbs and waiting for the end of the world. Thus ends chapter 19. In New Jerusalem, the prophet makes a speech about how the plagues are beginning and everybody needs to amass 2 months of food and water storage. At the end of the speech, the prophet mentions that Josh and Colton are in Jerusalem. He sort of tacks that on. According to the prophecies, Josh and Colton will be there for 3.5 years, which makes me wonder how long they've been there at this point and how much longer these stupid books are going to go on. The third plague arrives. Disappointingly, all it does is extend the second plague to rivers and lakes. So now all the water on Earth is red and full of some kind of mineral that makes people really sick to drink. Luckily, the Mormons have their food storage, and in Jerusalem, they have ancient underground cisterns. I know there are ancient underground cisterns in Jerusalem. I don't know if they're still functioning. I have no idea if that's real. Elias reassures the billions of people living in coalition nations that the water will clear up in a few days. He's now very famous, but his name is difficult for the Chinese to pronounce, so they just start calling him Gog. Yeah, they went from Elias to Gog. Chad chose Gog because it's in the Book of Revelation. There is no normal phonological process by which Elias can become Gog. Thus ends chapter 20. Emma and Tad are hanging out at home when they see an enormous solar flare. This is the beginning of the fourth plague, scorching heat. So many people passed away from the heat in New Jerusalem that the saints had resorted to family members digging shallow graves in a designated corner of their community parks and then dedicating the site at dawn, rather than having full-fledged funerals. In some ways, the heat wave was a final refining fire for many of the saints. If they endured this final test without too much complaining, they crossed over into eternal glory. The tests never end. Does God really mind if we complain? What Chad is saying here is that people who complain don't deserve to go to heaven. He's added an 11th commandment, thou shalt not whine. 2 billion people die of heat and thirst. Satan is angry. It's not really clear why. He seems to think Elias should be doing something other than hiding underground. The heat wave lasts for a month, and then it rains, and Emma and Tad and their kids play in the mud. This is one of those chapters where it's really clear that Chad's just trying to check off end times prophecies without actually thinking about what such events would be like or trying to work them into any sort of storyline. The entire chapter is 5 pages long. Thus ends chapter 21. After blitzing through a month in 5 pages, Chad slows down so that we can join Emma's sons Charles and David and Charles's girlfriend Phyllis as they do landscaping work in the valley of Adam-on-Diamond. Jesus and Adam, the one from the Bible, are going to have this giant meeting out here, so they want the lawn mowed and the flower beds weeded. That afternoon, David asks Phyllis if she'll marry him, and she says yes. He gives her a diamond engagement ring, which surprised me because I thought everyone had quit caring about material possessions. 3 weeks later, they get married. Elder Smith performs their sealing ceremony in the temple, and he makes a series of bizarre remarks during the ceremony. I want to emphasize that all of the remarks I'm going to share from this scene are delivered one after another. There's no break or explanation between them. This is Elder Smith. It's a great privilege to be here today to seal these 2 wonderful young people together for eternity. I have dear friends in this room who have made sacrifices throughout their lives for the gospel's sake. What? This is a complete non sequitur. I'm so excited to be sealing these 2 people. A lot of my friends are dead. Is that what he's saying? What does this have to do with David and Phyllis getting sealed? Then he says, Not long ago, I was able to spend time with David's uncle Doug during some leadership meetings in the Salt Lake Temple, and he's a great man. I know his thoughts are with you today. Who cares about Doug? What does Doug have to do with this? This is David and Phyllis's ceiling. Doug isn't even there. Talk about David and Phyllis. Instead, he continues name-dropping. I also want to acknowledge Sister Kim Brown here with us. I greatly admire both Sister Brown and her husband, Elder Joshua Brown. We got to know each other when they were serving in Guatemala, and they've served faithfully ever since. As you know, Elder Brown is now performing a great task in the city of Jerusalem, and our prayers are with him. Josh isn't related to David or Phyllis. It feels like Elder Smith just wants everybody to know he knows a famous person. My favorite part of which is, he had exactly one meeting with Kim and Josh when they were in Guatemala. It's not like he served beside them for weeks. He swung by one morning to have a quick meeting and then went on out of town. Then he says he can feel the spirits of Phyllis's family is there. She's done all their temple work, and apparently they've accepted Mormonism, and they're now in paradise, and Phyllis cries. Kim finishes doing the temple work for all her Peruvian ancestors. About 32,000 of them. And there's nothing more important in life than temple work. With all of those names now entered into the computer, it felt like a huge load had been lifted off her shoulders. Sure, her husband was thousands of miles away and was probably in constant danger, but she felt a great appreciation for the many blessings she had been given. Life was good. Okay. Chad spends a couple of pages describing how the world is falling apart. This section reads very much like his descriptions of how the US fell apart. He implies that although the water has cleared up and it's raining again in New Jerusalem, the heat wave plague is continuing in the rest of the world. I don't really know what this sentence means. As the saints in the Americas successfully battled against the effects of the fourth plague because of plentiful springs and occasional rainstorms, the rest of the world sank deeper into chaos because of the lack of fresh water. I think the word because is what's throwing me off. It's not a good sentence. Then Chad takes his usual dig at materialism. When the plague had first started, people had been able to trade their big screen televisions, computers, and DVDs for food. But now a loaf of bread was much more valuable than any collection of electronic equipment. Then he goes back to his favorite refrain about how everyone's going to lose their minds. Sadly, one particular ailment was growing increasingly common. Thousands of people simply went insane and wandered the streets babbling to themselves, unable to cope with the overwhelming changes. Yeah, Chad, you told us like 50 times. Thus ends chapter 22. Before chapter 23, there's a page that reads, 2 years later. This is page 151 of a book that's 176 pages long. Why jump forward 2 years? Why not just end this book and start the next one 2 years later? Chad's pacing has hit an all-time low here. Since 2 years have passed, the Jerusalem temple is now nearly finished. Josh has helped by using his priesthood powers to lift heavy beams. Meanwhile, he and Colton have converted a bunch of people to the LDS Church. Today, John the Beloved has showed up. He says he has news, but he doesn't really have any news. Don't get your hopes up. Here's what he does say. This pause in the plagues is the Lord's way of giving the inhabitants of the earth one more chance. He wants to see whether their suffering has been enough to turn their hearts to righteousness. Is it working? Josh asked. In a few areas, but most people either believe God has abandoned them or they blame him for their problems. So the version of God in this story continues to think that punishing people for not loving him is the way to get people to love him. That's not going to work, and it says something about Chad that he thinks it should. Josh asks about his family. Most importantly, how are our wives and kids doing? I knew that question would come up, so I checked in on them yesterday, John said. Kim has been working on a big family history project for her Peruvian ancestors for most of the time you've been here, so along with taking care of the twins, she's definitely staying busy. Thank goodness she hasn't been sitting around reading TV Guide. Then John talks about Colton's wife and their 4 kids. John turned to Colton. Cindy has also had her hands full with your active bunch, and some of them are as tall as you now. She's serving on the church's general board over physical fitness and athletics, and she loves it. Many of her ideas have been adopted throughout the church. The women in Zion are in better physical shape than they've ever been. How about the men? Colton asked. You'd think the plagues might have helped them slim down a little. Let's just say they're making progress, John said with a smile. What exactly is the implication here? That the women should all be thin and hot, but it's fine for the men to still be fat? Is that how Chad thinks things should be? Also, why are any of the men in Zion doing the exercise programs that Cindy has invented? Why can those only be done by women? Just curious. We jump to Elias, who is still the leader of the coalition. Now, the book of Revelation says that Israel will be attacked by Gog and Magog, and we've already seen how Chad tried to work Gog into the story. Now he tries with Magog. The term Magog had emerged among the general population to represent the coalition, and it played off the nickname of Gog that Elias had obtained. No explanation of why everyone started calling the coalition Magog. Also, you don't obtain a nickname. That's not a proper use of obtain. Elias is now more popular than ever, thanks to an overtly ridiculous publicity campaign. Elias had printed millions of leaflets that told how much he cared for each person, and that they were each a vital part of the coalition's rebuilding process. It was the same self-promotion techniques that had worked so well for other dictators in previous generations, but the people truly didn't see Elias as a dictator. Instead, he was becoming a messiah figure in their eyes who would bring them prolonged prosperity. I don't think Jesus ever brought anyone prolonged prosperity. I don't know what that means. It's astonishing to me that Chad thinks this would work, that he doesn't believe the majority of people would see through this. And where did he get this idea that dictators love bomb people? That is not what dictators do. That's what cult leaders do. Now that I think of it. Thus ends chapter 23. Kim prays to know how her ancestors are doing in the spirit world, and she's allowed to visit. So that night, in her sleep, she flies out of her body, and she and Tina fly past the Mountain of Diamonds, where Jesus lives, to a new city in paradise, where all Kim and Tina's Peruvian ancestors live. And Kim gets to meet each one of them and hear how grateful to her they are for doing their temple work. Then Tina tells Kim how she's jealous that Kim is married and has a husband. Tina hasn't met anyone in the spirit world that she considers marriage material. I'm not being sarcastic, she actually says that. Thus ends chapter 24. Tad and Emma are invited to the big meeting at Adam on Diamond. Well, technically Tad is invited and told to bring his wife, so... As with the scene in which Tara meets her parents, Chad stole much of this scene word for word from Escape to Zion. Only this time, Jesus doesn't want to thank Emma for her amazing time travel service because she didn't travel through time. So she and Tad just meet Joseph and Emma Smith. It's kind of anticlimactic. Thus ends chapter 25. Not far away, Satan is also watching the meeting. He's irritated about it, so he goes to Elias and tells him he needs to hurry up and attack Israel. Elias thinks they should wait and continue rebuilding slowly, but suddenly Elias's weariness turned to anger. Now he's all excited and decides not to wait any longer. There's no build-up to this. I don't even know what to say about it. It just comes out of nowhere. All of a sudden, he's ticked and he's ready to rumble. Thus ends chapter 26. Finally, we get Chad's usual ad for the next book in the series. And thus ends The Keys of the Kingdom, which should have been called The Keys to the Kingdom. Nobody talks about the keys of their car. I normally end these videos by talking about how Chad could have improved a book, and then discussing what we've learned about him from the way he writes. Frankly, this book is such a dumpster fire that it would take a dozen videos on how to fix it before I got anywhere, so I'm just going to focus on one element of Chad's writing, and that's point of view. As I've discussed previously, Chad wrote these books in third-person omniscient. What that means is that he writes, she did this, he did that, they did whatever else, rather than I did this, I did that. The omniscient part means that he can jump from any character's point of view to any other character's point of view at any time for any reason. Having an omniscient narrator that can see through anyone's eyes at any time is incredibly powerful. And we know what comes with great power. I've never seen anyone write in third-person omniscient the way Chad does. It's simply more power than he knows how to handle. It's like handing a fire hose to a 6-year-old. Everybody's getting sprayed. His narrator bounces from one character's point of view to another for no apparent reason. Before we go any further, I want to explain exactly what I'm talking about. Chapter 1 begins with an entire paragraph from Josh's point of view. Elder Josh Brown scanned the dark water of the Mediterranean Sea through the window of the jet carrying Elder Colton Nagus and himself toward the city of Jerusalem. Josh's heart was racing, wondering how the plane could possibly land safely anywhere in Israel. He knew the entire nation was on high alert against a possible invasion, and the odds were good their jet was already being tracked on Israeli radar screens. Here, we are experiencing the story through Josh's sense organs. He sees the water, he feels his heartbeat, he thinks, and yes, I'm calling the brain a sense organ for the purposes of this discussion. Although other characters might be able to see his eyes move, they can't really tell what he's looking at, so all of these descriptions make us aware that Josh is the character through which we're experiencing the story. Lines like this are important, not just because they establish point of view, but because they allow us to feel like we're in the story. Josh is the stand-in for the reader here. These sentences, the ones in which we experience what Josh is experiencing, are what emotionally connect us to the story. This is where all the feels come from. The character's point of view is our conduit of emotion. Not every line in a story is going to establish point of view the way the ones I just read did. For example, here's a sentence from the same scene that isn't in anyone's point of view. John's small jet had carried them from New Jerusalem to a refueling point in Maryland. Then they had refueled overnight on the Canary Islands. This is all factual information that the narrator is giving us that doesn't actually come through Josh's perceptions. And that's fine. If we tried to write every sentence so that it established point of view, everything would get bogged down. It's much better to just state information at times. One of these types of statements isn't better than the other. It isn't better to write sentences that are clearly in rather than out of a character's point of view. Rather, like everything in writing, it's about balance and deliberateness. I'm a big believer that rules are made to be broken, but only deliberately, only consciously. Here, we have two types of statements, and they're basically the heart and the head of a piece of writing. The statements that establish point of view come from the heart. The statements giving us concrete, factual information come from the head. We need both, and we need them in balance. And that's where Chad fails. There is no balance. Nothing feels deliberate. He hasn't thought about what he's doing. And there are multiple problems that he creates by just doing whatever he wants whenever he wants. I want to point out the two biggest. First, he will use any excuse to jump into a character's point of view. I actually went through this book with a pink highlighter and identified every sentence that established point of view. And then I made a list in Excel specifying whose point of view is included in each scene. And I found 30 different characters, including one category that was just they, and another that was simply Mormons in general. 30 characters, which, by the way, is too many bleeping characters for a book of this length. Chad sometimes gets into as many as 4 different characters' points of view in a single scene. Now, a really good writer could pull that off. A really good writer could probably pull that off with way more characters. I seem to recall that the undisputed master of third-person omniscience is Tolstoy. If you want to learn how to do this really well, go read Anna Karenina. But Chad often includes only a single sentence in each character's point of view in a scene. So if we look back at the scene that covers Daniel's funeral, we're talking about 4 different points of view in a scene that lasts 3 pages. There are only 5 sentences in this scene that establish point of view. So let's go through that and look carefully at how this works. The scene begins by describing Jonas's hunt for cupboards he can cut up to build a coffin for Daniel. After he builds it, we get this sentence. "You deserve so much better than this, little Daniel, but I did my best for you," Jonas said to himself as he looked at the finished coffin. This establishes that we're in Jonas's point of view by telling us that he's speaking to himself. Presumably, no one else could have told us this was happening. Then the scene continues at the cemetery, where we jump to Jason's point of view. Jason is a minor character from Escape to Zion, and I don't know why Chad brought him back. I don't think he's necessary, and putting the narrative in his point of view makes him feel like he's a lot more important than he is. This he here refers to Jason. He hadn't planned to take part in the service, but he knew he should share an experience he had witnessed. On the next page, we get another sentence in Jason's point of view. Jason paused, holding back his emotions. But 2 paragraphs later, we're bounced into Doug's point of view. Doug was definitely intrigued by Jason's story. Now, it could be argued that this line isn't fully in Doug's point of view. You could probably argue the same thing about the first line of Jonas's that I mentioned. It's possible that another character could have been observing Doug's behavior and drawn this conclusion, but that's kind of unlikely here. I mention it because I want to be clear that sometimes it isn't definitive which point of view a sentence is in. Also, I should mention that I'm using the word sentence a lot because it's sort of a convenient unit of measurement in this context, but it's possible to express more than one point of view in a single sentence. Thank God Chad never attempts that. Anyway, the scene then introduces a 4th point of view, that of Bishop Schultz, who only appears in this book. Bishop Schultz suddenly remembered something else he could add to Jason's account. How many of these points of view were necessary for this scene? Personally, I would have chosen either Doug or Jonas and stuck with that point of view for the entire scene. I don't like switching points of view mid-scene. Personally, I almost never do it. That's just my style. Other people will do it differently. But the effect that it has in this scene is that we never feel any deep emotion, because we never hear any deep emotion from the characters. We're barely in one person's head before we're jumping to another person's head. How can we sink down and feel what's in their heart? We can't. And that's part of what makes this whole funeral scene just so bizarre. The result of dipping this lightly into different characters' points of view, each time for only a sentence, is that the whole scene feels shallow. Everybody's emotions feel shallow. And that is the second major issue that this style of writing creates for Chad. All of his writing feels emotionally shallow and disconnected. I was actually shocked by how out of balance his writing is. He can go on for pages without reestablishing point of view. I mean, look how little pink there is here. And this isn't even unusual. There isn't a perfect ratio of point of view to non-point of view sentences. It's something that you have to play with to determine the perfect ratio for your story and your writing style. This is a funeral for an angelic 3-year-old. It needs to be intensely emotional. We need to feel it. Scenes that are highly emotional are going to require more point of view sentences to give them emotional impact. Less intense scenes require fewer point of view sentences. This general lack of point of view sentences is part of why Chad's characters feel so shallow, too. There are a lot of places where we, as readers, would expect to hear how something affects a character, and Chad doesn't include a point of view statement, so we either don't know how they feel, or we just assume they don't feel anything. One of the things I did while looking at this aspect of Chad's writing was to classify each scene according to how much of the text was made of point of view statements. I did this visually and with a simple low, medium, high designation. It wasn't super scientific. So if a scene had a high percentage of point of view statements, that one got a high. High kind of came in around, I would say, between 30 to 50%. And then probably 15 to 30% got a medium designation. Anything less got a low designation. Of the 85 individual scenes in this book, 43 scenes got deemed low, 22 got deemed medium, 9 were deemed high, and there were 11 scenes for which I was unable to determine any point of view at all. That's 13% of the book's scenes, by the way. Like I said, there isn't a perfect ratio, but having more than half the scenes in your book fall into the low category is too many, at least for religious fiction. And spreading your narration around between 30 characters is spreading it too thin. I wish I could give you an exact formula for how to get that balance right, but this is more like a piece of advice to keep in mind while you're editing. If you're getting feedback from readers saying that your story isn't emotionally compelling, maybe take a look at how often you're including point of view statements. If your writing feels overwrought and emotionally bogged down, maybe take a look at your point of view statements. Well, now that I have spoken at length about that, I'll be brief regarding what we've learned from this book about Chad, partly because we didn't learn that much. I think it's clear that in addition to being a racist, homophobic, fat-phobic, xenophobic, misogynist, animal-hating religious bigot, he's also likely an anti-Semite. I guess that shouldn't come as a surprise. I mean, once you've ticked off enough boxes in the terrible person category, you might as well just draw a line through the rest of them, right? The question I always come back to with Chad is actually why. Not why did he commit these crimes, but why did he have these characters act like this? Why does everyone have to wear white clothing? Why do Elias and Alex Rodriguez get into a feud that has to be mediated by Donald Trump? Why won't Jesus answer questions? And the answer is usually no reason. Like we said earlier, for whatever reason. That doesn't seem to be a question Chad asks himself. Why? I was watching a show about the Madeline Soto case last night. A very sad case. And a psychologist whose name I didn't catch was saying that because they have difficulty feeling and interpreting the emotions of other people, a lot of psychopaths can't tell that their ridiculous lies aren't landing. And I thought again of Chad. Maybe he actually can't tell that no one is buying that these characters would do these things. Maybe he really doesn't understand that his stories don't work. I don't know. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking or subscribing, and please join me again next week. I am sorry this video came out late. I've had some health stuff. I have family coming into town. It's just kind of a cluttered time in my life, frankly. However, I am going to try to put a video out next week. I think it's going to be a non-Daybell related video, my first. It'll probably be a nice short video on a craft-focused subject. And then the week after, I'll dig back into the last book in this awful series, The Renewed Earth, in which Emma finally dies. Interestingly, just 2 years before The Renewed Earth came out, Eckhart Tolle released a book called A New Earth. Renewed almost sounds like a bit of a one-up, doesn't it, in this context? Please don't reach out to or harass anyone involved in this case, and remember to use your words wisely. Thanks.